Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. We often think of the American Revolution as a simple story, 13 colonies against the British Empire. But Britain held far more than 13 colonies in North America. Some were closer to London, some were richer, some were newer, some had just been conquered. So why did only 13 choose rebellion? Why did the others stay out of it? The answer isn't really about loyalty. It's about what people stood to lose, and what they feared would disappear if British rule collapsed. When fighting began between Britain and its rebelling colonies in 1775, there was no political entity called Canada waiting to decide its allegiance. What existed instead was a collection of British possessions across northern North America, each governed differently and shaped by distinct histories. Treating them as a single unit risks misunderstanding the choices they made. These territories included Quebec, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, St. John's Island, and the vast interior known as Rupert's Land. They differed in language, religion, population density, and economic purpose. Some were long-standing settlements tied closely to Britain's Atlantic system, while others were recent acquisitions still adjusting to imperial rule. Quebec in particular stood apart. Recently conquered from France, it remained overwhelmingly French-speaking and Catholic, governed under civil law unfamiliar to Britain's other colonies. Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, by contrast, were more directly integrated into British naval and commercial networks. Rupert's Land functioned primarily as a trading domain rather than a settler society at all. These differences mattered because the American Revolution did not emerge everywhere British authority existed. It grew out of specific political expectations and institutional habits, especially in colonies where representative assemblies had long shaped local governance. Where those expectations were absent or newly formed, the meaning of British rule was different. Geography reinforced this divide. Northern populations were smaller, more dispersed, and less urbanized. Communication across long distances was slow, and organizing collective political action was difficult. Many communities were still focused on trade, defense, or survival, rather than constitutional debate. British policy also varied by colony. In some places, recent imperial actions were experienced as losses of authority or privilege. In others, they represented stability or accommodation. Whether British rule felt restrictive or protective depended on what colonists believed they stood to gain or lose by challenging it. Understanding why the revolution spread south but stopped north begins here. Before asking why the northern colonies did not join the rebellion, it is necessary to recognize that they were not responding to the same conditions, nor weighing the same choices. The story of their decision begins with the simple fact that they were not one country, and did not yet see themselves as one. The American Revolution did not begin as a rejection of empire in principle. For many colonists, it emerged from a belief that their place within the British Empire had changed in ways that threatened expectations they had long taken for granted. They understood themselves as British subjects, but also as communities accustomed to managing much of their own political and economic life. After the 7 Years' War, Britain faced heavy financial burdens and sought to tighten control over its empire. New taxes and stricter enforcement of trade regulations followed. While these measures were legal within Parliament's understanding of imperial authority, they were experienced differently in the colonies, where local assemblies had traditionally played a central role in approving taxation and shaping policy. The issue was not taxation alone, but the process by which it was imposed. In the English-speaking colonies, political legitimacy had come to be associated with consent given through representative institutions. When Parliament asserted its right to tax without colonial approval, many colonists interpreted this as a shift in the rules of governance rather than a temporary policy change. What had once seemed negotiable now appeared structural. Economic pressures sharpened this sense of unease. Merchants and farmers alike faced disrupted trade, mounting debts, and limits on expansion into Western lands. For communities that had expected growth and opportunity after years of war, imperial restrictions felt like a narrowing of future prospects. Political arguments gained traction because they aligned with tangible economic concerns. Equally important was the environment in which these ideas circulated. The 13 colonies were relatively populous and interconnected, with newspapers, town meetings, and local networks capable of sustaining political debate. Disputes in one colony quickly resonated in others, allowing shared grievances to evolve into a coordinated movement rather than isolated protests. At first, many colonists sought compromise rather than separation. Petitions, boycotts, and negotiations reflected an effort to preserve their status within the empire on revised terms. Independence became a serious objective only as repeated attempts at reconciliation failed and trust in imperial restraint eroded. By the time armed conflict began, the revolution had become a response to a perceived incompatibility between British authority and colonial expectations. This dynamic explains why rebellion gained momentum where it did. It also sets a crucial point of comparison. The northern colonies would evaluate British rule through different experiences and therefore reach different conclusions. Quebec entered the revolutionary era from a position unlike any of Britain's other North American colonies. Only a decade earlier, it had been transferred from French to British rule, placing a French-speaking Catholic population under a Protestant empire with unfamiliar institutions. The immediate concern for most inhabitants was not political reform, but whether their language, religion, and legal customs would be preserved. British officials understood that governing Quebec required a different approach. Attempts at rapid assimilation risked destabilizing a colony that had only recently been secured. Instead, imperial policy moved toward accommodation, culminating in the Quebec Act of 1774. This legislation reshaped Quebec's relationship with Britain in ways that directly addressed local anxieties. The Quebec Act guaranteed the free practice of Catholicism and restored French civil law for private matters. It also expanded the colony's territorial boundaries, giving Quebec greater control over its hinterland and trade routes. For many residents, these measures were not abstract gestures, but concrete protections of daily life and economic security. South of the border, the act was received very differently. Protestant colonists in the 13 colonies viewed it with suspicion, seeing it as a threat to their own religious norms and Western ambitions. In Quebec, however, the same policy suggested that British rule could be flexible and responsive. At a moment of uncertainty, the empire appeared willing to adapt rather than impose uniformity. This distinction shaped how revolutionary appeals were received. Arguments about lost English liberties carried limited weight in a colony that did not share that political tradition. The most significant recent intervention by Parliament had not removed rights but formalized them. Rebellion in this context offered no obvious improvement. The alternative presented by the American rebels was also unconvincing. Many of their leaders openly resented the privileges granted to Quebec and expressed hostility toward Catholicism. Aligning with such a movement raised questions about whether existing protections would survive a change in authority. For Quebec, then, loyalty was not a matter of ideological attachment to Britain, but of comparative risk. British rule, though imperfect, had demonstrated a capacity for accommodation. The revolutionary cause, by contrast, offered uncertainty. Faced with that choice, most in Quebec saw little reason to overturn a system that had recently begun to work in their favor. When France entered the war in support of the American rebels, it introduced a new variable into the conflict, but not one that fundamentally altered Quebec's calculations. Cultural memory alone was not enough to outweigh the realities of power, trade, and governance that had developed since 1763. For most of Quebec's population, the question was not which empire they preferred in theory, but which arrangement best protected their interests in practice. By the late 18th century, France's priorities had shifted. The loss of Quebec after the 7 Years' War was accepted as part of a broader imperial settlement, and French policymakers showed little interest in reclaiming the colony. Their support for the American cause was strategic, aimed at weakening Britain rather than restoring former territories. Quebec was peripheral to those ambitions. Economic considerations reinforced this distance. Under British rule, Quebec had access to extensive Atlantic trade networks that linked it to markets across the empire. This commercial integration offered stability and opportunity that any political realignment would put at risk. A return to French control, even if it had been realistic, did not promise comparable advantages. Equally important was the nature of British governance within the colony. The Quebec Act had demonstrated that imperial authority could accommodate religious and legal difference. That experience mattered in shaping local perceptions of risk. The American rebels, by contrast, had given little assurance that such arrangements would be preserved. Their rhetoric often reflected suspicion toward Catholicism and resentment of Quebec's favored status. The American invasion of Quebec in 1775 and 1776 made these concerns tangible. Rather than inspiring widespread support, it exposed the limits of revolutionary appeal. Military pressure and uncertain leadership underscored how little control the rebels could guarantee over events in the region. For many residents, the invasion confirmed that the revolution was not aligned with their immediate interests. French intervention, then, did not reopen old loyalties so much as highlight new realities. It offered Quebec no clear path to greater security, autonomy, or prosperity. In contrast, British rule had begun to feel predictable, and predictability carried weight in a contested imperial world. As a result, Quebec remained outside the revolutionary coalition, even as the war expanded around it. Nova Scotia occupied a middle position between the rebelling colonies and the more distinct case of Quebec. Many of its settlers had come from New England, carrying similar assumptions about local governance and economic opportunity. When Britain tightened imperial controls after the 7 Years' War, those changes were felt here as well. New trade regulations and taxes disrupted commerce and provoked frustration, particularly among merchants and ship owners. Protests and occasional riots reflected genuine discontent with imperial policy. In isolation, these reactions resembled early resistance in the 13 colonies. What limited this discontent was the colony's social structure. Nova Scotia was sparsely populated, with communities spread across long distances, and few large towns capable of sustaining coordinated political organization. Without dense urban networks, opposition remained local rather than strategic. Economic dependence further narrowed the range of options. Halifax was a major British naval base, and the imperial military presence shaped the colony's economy. Employment, trade, and political authority were closely tied to Britain, making open defiance costly even before war began. As a result, dissatisfaction did not disappear, but it stalled. Before shots were fired, Nova Scotia was a place where grievances existed without a clear path toward rebellion. That balance would not last once the conflict itself reached the colony. Once the American Revolution turned into open war, Nova Scotia's political uncertainty narrowed sharply. The conflict introduced immediate risks that reframed earlier grievances. Questions about representation and trade gave way to concerns about safety, property, and survival. American privateers brought the war directly to the coast. Raids disrupted shipping, damaged settlements, and exposed how vulnerable scattered communities could be. Whatever sympathy some residents had felt for the revolutionary cause was now tested by experience rather than argument. These attacks altered how British power was perceived. The Royal Navy's presence became less a symbol of imperial control and more a practical source of protection. Stability, rather than reform, emerged as the priority that shaped local decisions. The war also clarified the limits of alternative authority. The rebels could not guarantee security in the region, nor could they offer a credible replacement for British naval power. For many in Nova Scotia, that uncertainty carried more weight than unresolved political grievances. By this point, allegiance was no longer an open question. The war itself resolved it. Each disruption reinforced the connection between British presence and local stability, closing the space in which rebellion might have taken root. Loyalty was not chosen out of conviction, but out of necessity. Newfoundland's position within the British Empire differed fundamentally from that of the mainland colonies. Its economy centered almost entirely on the cod fishery, an industry deeply integrated into British commercial networks. Many who worked there were recent migrants from Britain or seasonal laborers who returned home regularly, reinforcing strong ties to the metropole. This economic structure shaped political life. Newfoundland lacked the representative institutions that had fostered expectations of self-government elsewhere. Governance was more direct, and for most residents, largely secondary to the rhythms of trade and fishing. Political grievances, when they arose, had little institutional outlet through which they could be pursued. Geographic distance reinforced this orientation. The colony was remote from the centers of revolutionary activity, and communication with the southern colonies was limited. The shared political identity that linked the 13 colonies did not extend naturally across the North Atlantic. Events to the south were observed, but they did not define local concerns. Dependence on Britain was also immediate and tangible. Access to British markets, protection for shipping, and the legal framework governing the fishery all relied on imperial support. Disrupting that relationship threatened the economic foundation of the colony. Independence offered no clear alternative capable of sustaining the industry on which livelihoods depended. Cultural affiliation reinforced these calculations. Many in Newfoundland saw themselves as Britons working overseas rather than colonists seeking political autonomy. Their expectations focused on stability and continuity, not constitutional change. In that context, the revolution appeared less as a shared struggle and more as a conflict unfolding elsewhere. For Newfoundland, then, rebellion did not fail because it was suppressed, but because it never aligned with local interests. The incentives that drove independence in the South were largely absent, leaving little reason to challenge a system that supported both identity and livelihood. Across the northern colonies, decisions made by local elites shaped the limits of political possibility. In Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, leadership rested with officials, merchants, and military officers whose fortunes were closely tied to Britain. Their income, status, and authority depended on imperial connections that rebellion would place at risk. Unlike many leaders in the 13 colonies, these elites had not experienced a sharp loss of influence as a result of imperial reforms. British policies that disrupted southern colonial economies did not threaten their core interests in the same way. Without a sense of personal or institutional displacement, the incentive to challenge imperial authority remained weak. Political structures reinforced this alignment. Authority in the northern colonies was more centralized and closely integrated with imperial administration. There were fewer venues through which opposition could be organized or sustained. Even where dissatisfaction existed, it lacked the leadership necessary to transform grievance into coordinated action. Geography amplified these constraints. Nova Scotia and Newfoundland lay closer to Britain than the rebelling colonies to the south, making the presence of imperial power immediate and credible. British naval forces could respond quickly to unrest, and this proximity shaped expectations on both sides. Defiance carried a high probability of swift retaliation. This reality influenced not only strategy, but perception. British authority did not feel distant or abstract. It was visible in garrisons, ships, and officials. In such an environment, loyalty was reinforced by the expectation that Britain would remain the dominant force in the region, regardless of events farther south. Without elite support, popular discontent had little room to develop. The revolution required sustained organization and risk-taking, neither of which found a stable foundation in the northern colonies. As the war progressed, the absence of leadership willing to challenge imperial power became a decisive factor in maintaining the status quo. By the later stages of the American Revolution, the boundaries of the conflict were no longer defined by ideology alone, but by experience. The war clarified which communities believed their future depended on breaking from Britain and which saw greater security in remaining within the empire. That division followed patterns of circumstance rather than abstract principle. In the 13 colonies, rebellion grew out of a convergence of political expectations, economic pressure, and the capacity to organize sustained resistance. British authority came to be seen as incompatible with local autonomy, and independence emerged as a viable alternative. North of that line, those conditions rarely aligned. Quebec experienced British rule as accommodation rather than dispossession. Recent policies had protected religious practice, preserved legal traditions, and expanded territorial security. For a society still adjusting to conquest, the empire appeared adaptable enough to tolerate difference. Rebellion promised no comparable assurance. In Nova Scotia, shared grievances were constrained by economic dependence and security concerns. The war itself transformed potential sympathy into caution, as raids and instability made British protection more valuable than political change. Loyalty hardened not because resistance was unthinkable, but because it became impractical. Newfoundland's economy, identity, and governance were even more tightly bound to Britain. Independence addressed problems the colony did not face and threatened systems it relied upon. In that setting, rebellion was not suppressed so much as rendered irrelevant. Taken together, these choices reveal the revolution as a contingent event rather than a continental inevitability. It succeeded where British authority collided with entrenched expectations and failed where it adapted, protected, or remained indispensable. The absence of a northern uprising was the result of rational decisions made under different constraints, not a lack of awareness or conviction.